The Tunisian sun beats down. The sand is no longer a battlefield, but a vast waiting room. For weeks we fought for every dune, fueled by promises of victory and chilling stories of the enemy's savagery. Now we are the defeated. An American Sherman tank idles nearby, its crew watching us, their faces unreadable. We are the vaunted Afrika Korps, and we are prisoners. They told us to expect brutality. They promised us a monstrous enemy. But as the first American soldier approaches, he isn't holding a weapon of vengeance, he's holding a canteen of water. This single, simple gesture was the first crack in a carefully constructed world view. For tens of thousands of German and Italian soldiers, the end in North Africa in May of 1943 was not the glorious death promised by their Führer, but a quiet, bewildering anticlimax. An entire army group, numbering some 250,000 men, had ceased to exist. The plains around Tunis and Bizerte, once arenas of clashing armor, were now vast parking lots of surrendered panzers and abandoned artillery, monuments to a failed campaign. This was a surrender on a scale that was difficult to comprehend, a logistical nightmare for the Allies, and a moment of profound psychological reckoning for the vanquished. The men who laid down their arms were the product of a decade of intense indoctrination. They had been told they were a master race, their leaders infallible, and their enemies subhuman. American soldiers, in particular, were painted by Goebbels's propaganda machine as a collection of gangsters, cowboys, and culturally bankrupt degenerates. They were supposedly soft, undisciplined, and prone to barbaric cruelty when victorious. The German soldier, steeled by years of war from Poland to the gates of Moscow and the sands of El Alamein, expected the worst. They anticipated summary executions, beatings, and starvation. What they received was something far more disarming: professional, organized, and almost detached efficiency. American GIs, many of whom were barely out of their teens and just as wary of their prisoners, were under strict orders. They moved with a purpose that was not born of hatred, but of procedure. Prisoners were systematically disarmed, searched, and sorted into groups. The process was impersonal, bureaucratic, and utterly contrary to the chaotic bloodbath they had been led to expect. This disciplined approach was the first unspoken message from the victors. We are not the monsters you were told we were. This initial shock rippled through the ranks, from the lowest private to the highest echelons of command. Field Marshal Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, the man who had inherited command of the Afrika Korps from the legendary Rommel, was now a prisoner himself. His capture symbolized the totality of the defeat. There was no Dunkirk-style evacuation, no last-ditch stand. An entire theater of war had simply been erased from the map. As the columns of defeated soldiers were marched towards coastal collection points near Algiers, the first acts of humanity began to systematically dismantle years of propaganda. American medics treated German wounded with the same urgency as their own. Guards shared cigarettes. Quartermasters, facing the immense task of feeding a captured city's worth of men, distributed sea rations and fresh water without prejudice. For a soldier from a regime that preached the inherent inequality of man, this adherence to a code of conduct, this recognition of a shared humanity, was a powerful and subversive weapon. It didn't scream, it whispered. It suggested that the world was more complex than the stark, black and white certainties they had been taught. It planted a seed of doubt that would have the entire Atlantic crossing to germinate. The Allied command understood, perhaps better than their counterparts, that a prisoner of war is more than just a captured combatant. They are an intelligence asset, a labor resource, and most importantly, an ideological battleground. The decision to treat the captured Axis forces in accordance with the Geneva Convention was not merely an act of moral principle, it was a calculated strategic choice. Every act of decency was a counter-argument to the Nazi regime. While Berlin was demanding its soldiers fight to the last bullet, America was preparing a vast logistical pipeline to transport, house, and feed its new prisoners. Great convoys of Liberty ships, the workhorses of the Allied supply chain, were being marshaled. Their destination was not a desolate penal colony, but the heartland of the nation they had been fighting. The journey across the Atlantic would be the next phase in this undeclared war for the soul. The German soldiers, stripped of their weapons and their leaders, were about to embark on a voyage that would take them further from home than they could ever imagine, not just in distance, but in perception. The physical war in Africa was over. A new, more subtle conflict was just beginning. The Anabasis, from the dusty plains of Tunisia to the shores of the New World, was an operation of staggering scale. Imagine the strategic calculus. The Battle of the Atlantic was still a lethal, high-stakes game of cat and mouse. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes, and every vessel crossing was a potential tomb. Yet, the Allied command dedicated precious naval resources, destroyers, corvettes, and air cover, to escorting ships laden not with tanks or ammunition, but with the very soldiers they had just fought. Vessels like the USS Monterey, a converted ocean liner, were filled to capacity with thousands of German prisoners. For the men packed into the holds of these Liberty ships, the journey itself was a disorienting experience. Confined below deck, they were rocked by the ceaseless rhythm of the ocean, a world away from the desert they had known for years. They were cut off from their command, from their families, from the entire propaganda apparatus that had shaped their reality. In this vacuum, all they had were their thoughts and the conduct of their guards. The American sailors and military police aboard these transports were the first true ambassadors of a different world. Their behavior, often a mix of curiosity, professional duty, and occasional casual friendliness, continued to chip away at the ingrained image of the enemy. The arrival in America was the second great shock. Instead of being met by angry mobs or herded into squalid camps at the docks, the prisoners were processed through well-organized reception centers. From the ports of Virginia and New York, they were put on trains. For men who came from a nation where the train was a symbol of military might, and more sinisterly, of deportation to the camps of the East, this journey was surreal. Looking out of the windows, they did not see a nation crippled by war, as their own propaganda had claimed. Instead, they saw a country that seemed utterly untouched by the global conflict. They saw bustling cities, vast, neatly tended farms stretching to the horizon, and civilians going about their lives with an air of normalcy and prosperity that was jarring. They passed factories, churning out the very Sherman tanks and bombers that had defeated them, not shuttered and bombed out ruins. This visual evidence was a direct, irrefutable contradiction to everything they had been told. The American war machine, it turned out, was fueled by an economy so powerful it could fight a two-front global war while its civilian life continued with an almost peacetime abundance. This realization was profoundly demoralizing. Their nation was demanding total sacrifice from its people, while their enemy seemed to be waging war as a mere industrial exercise. The final destination for the highest-ranking officers, including Field Marshal von Arnim and his staff, was a specially prepared facility deep in the American South, Camp Clinton, Mississippi. This was not a hastily erected stockade of barbed wire and guard towers. It was a purpose-built community, laid out with the precision of an American suburb. The prisoners were assigned to barracks that were clean, weatherproof, and far more comfortable than the front-line dugouts they had called home for months. They were issued fresh uniforms. Surplus American fatigues dyed a different color, but still serviceable and clean. There were libraries, sports fields, and classrooms. The camp was a world unto itself, governed by a rigid adherence to international law. The United States Army was not just warehousing an enemy, it was demonstrating a system. The Geneva Convention of 1929 was the camp's constitution, a document that guaranteed the prisoners' rights that their own government had systematically stripped from millions. The right to receive mail, the right to adequate food, the right to practice their religion, the right to humane treatment. These were not privileges granted at the whim of a commandant, but established articles of war meticulously upheld. This environment was a crucible for the German officer corps. These were educated, professional soldiers, men of aristocratic or military families who had formed the backbone of the Wehrmacht. They were accustomed to a rigid hierarchy and a code of honor. At Camp Clinton, they found themselves in a bizarre mirror world. Their ranks and titles were recognized by their American captors. They were permitted to maintain their own internal command structure for the purposes of camp administration. But this framework of respect was wielded as a tool of psychological recalibration. The camp's commander could deal with a German general on a formally correct officer-to-officer basis, while simultaneously proving through his actions that the American system he represented was not just stronger, but also more just. It created a profound cognitive dissonance. How could a nation of degenerates run a prison camp with more honor and efficiency than their own Reich treated its conquered peoples? This question would hang in the humid Mississippi air, unspoken but persistent, as the prisoners settled into a routine that was designed to do more than simply contain them. It was designed to change them. Perhaps the most potent weapon in Camp Clinton's arsenal was not its guards' rifles, but its kitchen. For soldiers who had spent months on the front lines subsisting on meager, often spoiled rations trucked across the desert, the food provided by their American captors was a revelation. The Geneva Convention stipulated that prisoners of war must receive rations equivalent to those of the capturing army's own depot troops. For the United States military, this meant a daily caloric intake of around 3,000 calories, a veritable feast by the standards of any other army in the world. The German prisoners were stunned. They received regular servings of fresh meat, bread, vegetables, milk, and coffee. Items that were becoming rare luxuries back in the Reich, like butter and sugar, were commonplace. This wasn't just sustenance. It was a display of overwhelming logistical and agricultural supremacy. Every meal served in the mess hall at Camp Clinton was a silent testament to America's power. It told the prisoners that the nation they were fighting could afford to feed its enemies better than their own homeland could feed its soldiers. This simple biological fact was more convincing than any leaflet or radio broadcast. It struck at the very core of the Nazi mythos of scarcity and heroic sacrifice. The story, perhaps apocryphal but nonetheless illustrative, of a high-ranking German general tasting a simple American meal and declaring it superior to the lavish state banquets of the Third Reich, captures a profound truth. The banquets in Berlin were theatrical performances designed to project an image of power and opulence. But the food itself was often sourced from the plundered fields of conquered nations, a feast built on starvation. The meal at Camp Clinton, perhaps fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans served on a simple metal tray, was the product of a system. It was authentic, abundant, and required no pretense. It was power that didn't need to be displayed because it could be tasted. This contrast between the hollow spectacle of Nazism and the substantial reality of American productivity was devastating. It forced the prisoners to confront a disquieting question. If their leaders had lied to them about the enemy's weakness and decadence, what else had they lied about? The daily ritual of eating became a form of re-education. It broke down the ideological certainties of the prisoners bite by bite. Beyond the mess hall, the camp was structured to combat the two greatest enemies of a prisoner's mind: boredom and despair. The American authorities understood that idle hands and hopeless minds could lead to unrest, escape attempts, and a hardening of ideological resolve. Their solution was to offer opportunities. The prisoners were given access to a well-stocked library, filled with books in both German and English. They could take courses, from basic English lessons to university-level subjects, often taught by fellow prisoners who had been academics in civilian life. They were encouraged to form orchestras, put on theatrical plays, and engage in sports. The camp had soccer leagues that were followed with the same passion as any in Europe. This was not mere coddling. It was a subtle but brilliant psychological strategy. By allowing the prisoners to engage in civilized pursuits, the camp administration was implicitly reminding them of a world beyond the narrow, militaristic confines of Nazism. They were treating them not just as soldiers, but as men with intellects, talents, and a capacity for culture that their own regime had sought to channel exclusively toward conquest and destruction. This environment fostered introspection. A German officer, after spending his morning studying Shakespeare and his afternoon playing soccer, would return to his barracks to write a letter home, a letter that would be read by American censors, but would nevertheless arrive. He was living in a state of suspended animation, a bizarre pocket of peace in the middle of a world at war. This peaceful, orderly, and well-fed existence stood in stark contrast to the news trickling in from Europe. News of devastating bombing raids on German cities, of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, and of a homeland demanding ever greater sacrifices from its civilian population. The letters from their families, when they arrived, spoke of rationing, fear, and loss. The prisoners at Camp Clinton were, ironically, among the safest and best-fed Germans in the world. This profound disconnect between their own relative comfort and the suffering of their loved ones created a powerful sense of guilt, but also a growing awareness that the war was not the glorious crusade they had been promised. The very decency of their treatment became a source of mental anguish, forcing them to reevaluate the cause for which they had fought and for which their country was being destroyed. The intellectual and cultural life fostered within Camp Clinton was more than just a way to pass the time. It became a laboratory for denazification, driven not by overt propaganda, but by the prisoners themselves. The American camp authorities largely adopted a hands-off approach to the political life of the internees, a strategy that proved remarkably effective. They provided the materials, the books, the classrooms, the space for debate, and allowed the internal dynamics of the prisoner population to do the rest. Within the wire fences, a microcosm of German society began to form, complete with its own political factions. Staunch, committed Nazis formed their own cliques, attempting to enforce party discipline and maintain morale for the final victory. At the other end of the spectrum were the anti-Nazis, men who had long harbored doubts about the regime and now found, for the first time in years, a space where those doubts could be cautiously expressed. In the middle was the vast majority, apolitical soldiers, professionals who had served the state out of duty or patriotism, but who were now adrift, their ideological anchors severed. It was in this fertile ground that the seeds of democratic thought began to take root. Prisoners who had been lawyers, professors, or politicians before the war started to organize informal seminars and discussion groups. They began to dissect the anatomy of their nation's catastrophe. Using the resources of the camp library, they studied the history of the Weimar Republic, analyzing its failures. They read the foundational documents of American democracy, the Constitution, and the Federalist Papers, not as enemy propaganda, but as political science texts. For many, this was the first time they had been exposed to these ideas in a neutral, academic context. It was a slow, Socratic process of questioning. Why had their political system collapsed? What were the safeguards that prevented one man from seizing absolute power? What did a government of the people, by the people, for the people, actually mean in practice? These were not abstract questions. They were existential. Their entire world had been built on the principle of the Führer, the singular will of one man. Now they were confronting a system built on the opposite principle, the diffusion of power and the consent of the governed. The American authorities subtly encouraged this intellectual ferment. They identified and quietly supported the emerging anti-Nazi leadership within the camp. They ensured that books on democratic theory and Western history were readily available. They even started a camp newspaper, edited and written by the prisoners themselves, which became a forum for cautious debate and the dissemination of new ideas. This process was not without risk. The hardline Nazis saw these activities as treasonous and often used intimidation and violence against those they deemed re-educationists. There were secret trials and beatings within the barracks, but the tide was turning. As the war news grew grimmer for Germany, the credibility of the Nazi ideologues waned. Their promises of wonder weapons and final victory rang increasingly hollow against the backdrop of Allied advances and the systematic destruction of the Third Reich. The arguments of the Democrats, grounded in logic and the observable reality of their captors' system, gained traction. The prisoners were essentially conducting a post-mortem on their own country while it was still breathing its last. This gradual internal shift in ideology was the ultimate success of what could be called the weapon of decency. It achieved what years of bombing and battlefield attrition could not. It changed minds. The strategy was based on a profound understanding of human psychology. Direct, heavy-handed propaganda would have been met with cynicism and resistance. It would have been dismissed as the predictable rhetoric of a victorious enemy. But by creating an environment of safety, intellectual freedom, and humane treatment, the Americans allowed the prisoners to arrive at their own conclusions. The evidence was all around them, in the well-stocked library, in the fair treatment from the guards, in the simple, undeniable quality of the food on their plates. They weren't being told that the American system was better. They were living the proof of it. This experience transformed many of them from soldiers of the Third Reich into future citizens of a new, democratic Germany. They were being prepared for a future they could not yet see, a future in which they would be tasked with rebuilding a nation from the moral and physical rubble of Nazism. The education they received at Camp Clinton would be as crucial to that task as any Marshall Plan aid. As 1944 bled into 1945, the atmosphere inside Camp Clinton and other prisoner-of-war camps across America shifted. The trickle of news from the front lines became a flood, and the narrative was one of unequivocal German collapse. The Normandy landings, the liberation of France, the Battle of the Bulge, and the inexorable advance of the Red Army from the east, each event was another nail in the coffin of the Third Reich. For the prisoners, this was a period of intense psychological torment. They were safe, but their families were in the path of the storm. They read censored accounts of Allied bombing campaigns that were reducing their home cities to ash. They were caught in a painful paradox. The victory of their captors, the very people who were treating them with dignity and respect, meant the utter destruction of their homeland and the potential death of their loved ones. This duality created a profound schism in their loyalties and forced a final, painful reckoning with the nature of the regime they had served. The most hardened Nazis fell into despairing silence, while those who had embraced a new way of thinking now looked to the future with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The end came in May of 1945. The news of Germany's unconditional surrender was not a moment of celebration in the camps, but one of somber reflection. The war was over. The cause for which millions had died was lost. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted just 12. Now, a new question dominated every conversation in the barracks. What comes next? For years, their lives had been suspended. Now they were about to be thrust back into the stream of history, but into a world they could no longer recognize. The process of repatriation was not immediate. The logistical challenges of moving millions of soldiers and displaced persons around the globe meant that many German prisoners would remain in the United States for months, even a year, after the war's end. This interim period was crucial. It was a time for the lessons learned at Camp Clinton to solidify, a time for the prisoners to mentally prepare for the reality they were about to face. They were no longer just prisoners of war, they were citizens of a defeated and occupied nation, and they would be returning with a unique and powerful perspective. The journey home was the reverse of their arrival, a transatlantic voyage back to a shattered continent. This time, as they looked out from the decks of the ships, they were not looking towards a land of impossible abundance, but towards the ruins of their own civilization. They docked in ports like Le Havre or Bremerhaven, cities that were little more than landscapes of rubble. They were processed by Allied authorities and then began the final leg of their journey into the heart of a broken Germany. The scenes that greeted them were apocalyptic. They saw firsthand what they had only read about in newspapers: the bombed-out cities, the skeletal remains of factories, and a civilian population that was gaunt, traumatized, and struggling for survival. The contrast between the America they had just left, a nation of plenty, order, and vibrant life, and the Germany they returned to was the final, devastating confirmation of the regime's failure. It was one thing to be told your cause was wrong. It was another to see the catastrophic consequences etched into the very landscape of your home. Upon their return, these men became a unique and often misunderstood demographic. To some of their fellow Germans, who had endured the horrors of the bombing and the final brutal battles, these repatriated prisoners seemed different. They were healthier, better fed, and they carried with them strange ideas about democracy and individual rights. They were sometimes met with suspicion, even resentment. They were men who had, in a sense, sat out the final, agonizing chapter of the war in relative comfort. Yet their experience had given them something invaluable, a vision of an alternative. They had seen a functioning democratic society up close. They had been treated according to a rule of law that stood in stark opposition to the arbitrary terror of the Gestapo. They carried within them the proof that a nation could be powerful without being tyrannical, and prosperous without being predatory. This knowledge would be essential in the monumental task of rebuilding Germany, not just physically, but morally and politically. The former prisoners of Camp Clinton and other American camps were about to become unwitting architects of a new Germany, their perspectives forged in the unexpected crucible of a humane captivity. The strategic significance of America's prisoner of war program extends far beyond the immediate tactical concerns of the Second World War. It represents one of history's most successful, if unconventional, psychological operations. The decision to adhere strictly to the Geneva Convention was a masterstroke of grand strategy, turning a logistical burden, the 250,000 Axis soldiers captured in North Africa alone, into a long-term political asset. In an age of total war, where ideologies clashed with the ferocity of armies, the United States chose to fight a different kind of battle. It was a battle not for territory, but for perception, not to break the enemy's body, but to win his mind. By demonstrating the core values of the society they were defending, justice, human dignity, and the rule of law, the camp administrators at places like Camp Clinton effectively disarmed the prisoners more completely than any battlefield surrender. They dismantled the central pillars of Nazi propaganda, not with counter-propaganda, but with reality. The humane treatment was not a sign of weakness, as Goebbels would have claimed, but an expression of profound and unshakable strength. Consider the alternative. A policy of brutal retribution, while perhaps emotionally satisfying in the heat of war, would have been a strategic catastrophe. It would have validated every piece of Nazi propaganda, strengthening the resolve of the German soldier to fight to the death rather than surrender. It would have fueled a cycle of atrocities and reprisals, making the eventual occupation and reconstruction of Germany infinitely more difficult. Furthermore, it would have been a betrayal of the very principles the Allies claimed to be fighting for, blurring the moral lines between their cause and that of the Axis. The American approach, rooted in a tradition of constitutional law and a belief in universal human rights, drew a clear and unambiguous line. It was a declaration that even in the midst of the most brutal conflict in human history, there were standards of conduct that would not be abandoned. This moral consistency was, in itself, a powerful weapon. It offered the German prisoners a glimpse of a world order not based on racial hierarchy and brute force, but on mutual respect and established legal norms. This strategy of ideological conversion through decency also paid tangible dividends during the post-war period. When the time came to rebuild West Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansionism, the United States had a valuable resource, a cohort of several 100,000 German men who had first-hand experience of American democracy and had returned home with a fundamentally altered worldview. These repatriated prisoners became community leaders, civil servants, businessmen, and educators. They were uniquely positioned to bridge the gap between the American occupiers and the German population. They could speak with credibility about American intentions, dispelling the lingering suspicions and resentments. They had seen the alternative to totalitarianism not in a textbook, but in their daily lives as prisoners. They understood, on a personal level, the connection between a nation's political system and its capacity for prosperity and justice. They became some of the most effective advocates for the new Federal Republic of Germany and its integration into the Western Alliance. The legacy of Camp Clinton and the broader American POW program is a powerful lesson in the nature of conflict and the meaning of victory. It demonstrates that true victory is not merely about defeating an enemy army, but about defeating the ideas that animated it. It shows that compassion and adherence to principle can be tools of statecraft, as potent as any tank or bomber. The story of the German generals who were surprised by the quality of American prison food is more than just a curious historical anecdote. It is a metaphor for the entire experience. They came expecting the bitter taste of defeat and retribution, but were instead given something that nourished them, something that unexpectedly tasted of a better future. The United States didn't just win the war in North Africa. It used the fruits of that victory to plant the seeds of a future peace, proving that sometimes the most effective way to change an enemy's mind is to first offer him a seat at the table. Portgebuche, awaiting confirmation. The long journey of the Afrika Korps prisoners from the sun-scorched earth of Tunisia to the green fields of Mississippi and back to the gray rubble of Germany is a testament to a forgotten dimension of warfare. It is a story where the decisive moments were not flashes of gunfire, but quiet instances of human connection and intellectual awakening. The transformation was profound. Men who had left Germany as believers in a creed of martial glory and racial superiority returned as something else entirely. They had been defeated in battle, yet in the strange crucible of their captivity, they had found the tools to build a new identity, both for themselves and for their nation. Their journey was measured not in thousands of nautical miles, but in the vast distance between ideological certainty and introspective doubt. For these individuals, the war did not end with the last shot. It ended with the first question they dared to ask themselves about the nature of the cause they had served. This experience stands in stark and terrible contrast to the fate of their comrades on the Eastern Front. There, the war was a struggle of annihilation, and surrender was often merely a prelude to a slower, more agonizing demise in the brutal camps of the Soviet Gulag. The humane treatment afforded by the Western Allies was not a universal standard of the conflict. It was a deliberate and calculated choice. This divergence in destinies underscores the philosophical chasm between the warring powers. The American system, for all its flaws, operated on a foundational belief in a universal humanity, a principle enshrined in its laws and, in this case, extended even to its bitterest enemies. This was not naive idealism. It was a pragmatic, long-term investment in a future peace, a recognition that the enemy of today could be the partner of tomorrow. The hundreds of thousands of healthy, intellectually engaged men who returned to Germany from American camps were a direct result of this strategic foresight. The impact of this encounter was not a one-way street. For the thousands of American soldiers who served as guards, translators, and administrators in the POW camps, the experience was also transformative. The enemy, once an abstract caricature from propaganda posters, took on a human face. The young guards from places like Iowa or Alabama discovered that the German prisoners were not all jackbooted fanatics. They were men who worried about their families, who told jokes, who were skilled craftsmen, and who felt the same pangs of homesickness. This daily interaction eroded the dehumanizing narratives that are so essential to industrial warfare. It was a quiet, grassroots-level peace process happening long before the diplomats convened. It reminded the American GIs what they were fighting for, a world where such basic, shared humanity could be recognized and respected, even in the midst of conflict. In the final analysis, the story of Camp Clinton is the story of an unconventional victory. The Third Reich was ultimately brought down by an overwhelming force of arms, by the courage of soldiers on a dozen fronts, and by the industrial might of the Allied nations. But the war against the idea of Nazism, the battle for Germany's future soul, was won in quieter places. It was won in a library in Mississippi, where a German officer rediscovered the banned works of Thomas Mann. It was won on a soccer field, where the shared rules of the game superseded the divisions of war. It was won in a mess hall, over a simple meal that spoke more eloquently of freedom and abundance than any political speech. This was the ultimate paradox. By treating their captives not as prisoners to be punished, but as men to be redeemed, the Americans secured a peace that was more durable, more meaningful, and ultimately more triumphant than any military conquest alone could ever have achieved.